Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see so many of you here tonight. Thanks for making it out on a weekday evening. My name's Nick Uwcsea, I'm the head of college, and it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to tonight's Kishore Mahbubani speaker series. In this event, we invite a whole community, parents, students, teachers, board members, others, to engage with our thinkers from the community and to inform our mission and how we go about what we do. Under the theme of inform, innovate and inspire, we seek to deepen our understanding of what it means to follow an ambitious mission for peace and a sustainable future, and how we can realize it in our own sphere and also personal and social spheres of the countries and the organizations of which we're all part. So today our topic, Singapore as a nation state, is one that for most countries may be a given. But for such a young country, for such a small country, a city-state in fact, for such a country with large and very different neighbours, for such a country in an historically unstable part of the world, it's a topic that should never be far from the surface of political and social discourse. So we're honoured today to welcome a distinguished speaker who's long been an acute observer and perhaps even shaper of this social and political arena. Janadas Devan was educated at the National University of Singapore and Cornell University in the United States. He taught English in various institutions in Singapore and the US, and later wrote for various publications, including the Straits Times, Singapore's preeminent newspaper, where, among other things, he wrote the weekly column on politics and economics, where he just told me he wrote things that are a good deal more controversial than appear today. And maybe we could follow that up later. Interesting. He rose to associate editor before leaving in 2012 on being appointed to the government chief of communication at the Ministry of Communication and Information, where he stayed until March 23, and he currently holds a number of other roles, including the Prime Minister's Office and Director of the Institute of Policy Studies at the LKY School of Public Policy at NUS. Of his time with the civil service, where he was presented with the rather daunting task of ushering in a period of change and reorganization at the Ministry of Communication, he writes, "I didn't know enough to be afraid," like so many of us probably taking on new roles. And he's fondly spoken of all the support from colleagues who, as he said, probably protected him from his worst mistakes. He enjoys working with people who talk back, challenge him, or in his own words, throw him the odd curveball. So you can think about that as you focus your questions from tonight. He's gone on record as saying that it's more rewarding when people feel empowered to voice their opinions, take the initiative to act, or feel comfortable making outrageous suggestions. And our students were very pleased to hear that as they formed their questions for him later today. So the format today will be an address from Janadas Devan and a conversation with our students, Emily, Genevieve, and Manat, and then questions from the floor. Please welcome me in welcoming Mr. Janadas Devan.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. It's the first international school I've spoken at in Singapore, or anywhere in the world for that matter. I will try and keep my remarks as brief as possible, 15, 20 minutes, and then, of course, we will have as questions, whatever questions you might want to ask, feel free to ask them, and I will answer them to the best of my ability. My subject today is about Singapore as a city-state. Many years ago, when on the eve of India's independence, the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, gave a remarkable speech on August 14th, 1947. He said, "Long years ago, we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time has come for us to redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of midnight, while the world sleeps, India shall awake to life and freedom." It's actually a remarkable speech. It's probably one of the greatest passages in the English language from the 20th century. Our founding Prime Minister, Kuan, on the occasion of Singapore's independence on August 9th, 1965, cried. He described that moment on television as a moment of anguish. He said he had spent his entire adult life fighting for merger with Malaya, which then of course became Malaysia, and that dream had now shattered. So what he had worked for his entire adult life was gone. And that was how our founding Prime Minister greeted Singapore's independence. It was not long years ago we made a tryst with destiny. It was actually an unwanted moment. Nobody in Singapore's founding leadership wanted Singapore independent. In fact, the 9 people who signed what was then called the separation agreement, separating us from Malaysia and therefore giving Singapore sovereignty, more than maybe 3 or 4 almost didn't sign the agreement. Mr. Rajaratnam, our first foreign minister, Dr. Toh Chin Chai, who was at that time Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Ong Pang Boon, who was, I think, Minister of Education at that point, almost didn't want to sign the agreement. They were persuaded to because the Prime Minister of Malaysia at that time told them there was no alternative. The only alternative to separation was bloodshed. And so they reluctantly signed. My own father, who was at that time leading the trade unions in Singapore and who had the misfortune of having been elected to the Malaysian Parliament in Malaysia, in other words, he was representing a constituency in Kuala Lumpur, not Singapore, refused to accept separation, and he refused to return to Singapore. It took them 3 years for Mr. Lee to convince him that Malaysia was no go, that he had to come back to Singapore. It took him 3 years. He spent 5 years in prison in the 1950s fighting for independence, but it was not for an independent Singapore. It was for an independent Malaya, of which Singapore was to be a part. So you have a very strange situation. Singapore was founded by a group of people who never intended Singapore to be independent. None of them. Not Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, whom we honor as our founding father and so on. None of them. So it is a strange situation. We are about the only sovereign independent country which wasn't intended to be sovereign and independent. Why? Because all of them, Mr. Lee, all his chief colleagues, began their political careers, began their lives, assuming Singapore was part of Malaya, and a city-state, or a city, sorry, we weren't even a state, could not exist on its own. That was, all of them began with that assumption. Everyone. There was a Malayan Communist Party that fought the Japanese and then fought the British, but there was no Singapore Communist Party. The British assumed that Singapore could not be independent by itself, which is why they mooted the idea of Singapore being part of a larger Malaysia. Tunku Abdul Rahman, the then Prime Minister of Malaya, which became independent before we did, 1957, didn't want Singapore because Singapore's admission to Malaya would have upset the racial balance. And so the British proposed Malaysia, which included Sabah and Sarawak, and then Singapore, so the racial balance could be maintained. Singapore's Chinese population would not have overwhelmed the Malays in Malaya with the inclusion of Bumi Putras, or local born, in Sabah and Sarawak. That's how Malaysia came into being. Sabah and Sarawak now find themselves in Malaysia because of us, Singapore. And some of them have never forgiven us for that. But that's how it came to be. So you have a situation, the first thing you have to understand about Singapore's history is that none of our founding leaders wanted or assumed Singapore could be independent. None of them. If you want to read, there's a famous series of talks that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew delivered in 1961 called The Battle for Merger. It's a really wonderful series of talks, really very powerful. Gave the history of the struggle, etc. But the subject of the talk was why Singapore could not survive on its own. It had to be part of Malaya. It had to have an hinterland. No country could survive, no city could survive on its own without a hinterland. 1965, we found ourselves independence. And it took a while, actually, for us to find a raison d'etre, a reason to exist. Mr. Rajaratnam, who was our Singapore's first foreign minister, is actually on record. He's the person who drafted the Singapore Pledge. He's on record in March or February 1966, quite a few months after separation and independence, and saying the idea of a Singapore identity is an absurdity. He said that. He says there can't be a Singapore identity. It has to be part of a larger whole. He's still, 6 months after that, the drafter of the Singapore Pledge said, actually, the idea of a Singapore identity is absurd. So it took a while for them to realize that actually Singapore's hinterland should not be Malaya, but it should be the world. That was the first big eureka moment in Singapore's existence, that you could survive not by being part of a hinterland that consists of Malaya and Sabah, Sarawak, Malaysia, but the world. In other words, you should conceive of yourself as a global city. When did that come about? 1971, Mr. Rajaratnam gave a speech, Singapore is a global city. It took a while for them to figure out that was how we should conceive of our existence. You leapfrog the region, you make connections with other global cities in order to give yourself a viable possibility of survival. Now, in retrospect, it all seems obvious, but actually, while we were going through the process, nothing was obvious. It wasn't in the least bit obvious that you could survive, because none of the founding leaders assumed that you could survive, which is why they fought so hard to be part of a larger entity, Malaysia. The dream collapsed. We can talk about why it collapsed, mainly because of the Malaysians had a different idea of how the different races should comport themselves from the Singapore leadership, and then we went our separate ways. Now in retrospect, of course, it all seems obvious, why can't it exist? But actually, when you take a look at it, it is very unlikely. How many city-states exist in the world today? There are only 3. You go in Google, they'll say there are 3 city-states in the world. Singapore is one, Monaco is the other, and the Vatican. Monaco is a tourist destination. Vatican has a direct line to God. So we are, in effect, the only city-state in existence. We are definitely the only city-state in existence with an army of our own, and a military of our own, a diplomatic service and a military of our own. London doesn't have a navy, Singapore has. New York doesn't have an air force, we do. Now, I've used this example before, just to focus your mind on how difficult it is to run this city that also happens to be a country. We are both a city and a country. There is no outside to this country other than the city. Because we are a city and a country, we have to perform a number of functions within the city that other countries don't have to. Number one, as I mentioned, we have to have a military. London, as I said, doesn't have a navy. We have to have a navy and an air force and an army. And it requires training areas. It requires places to base navy ships, places to base your jet fighters, etc. Places for the army to train. Actually, there's no place. Singapore Army does most of its training overseas. But nevertheless, you have to have places for camps, air force bases, navy, ports. That's number one. Number two, you have to have gateways, airports, and ports. Singapore began its existence as a port. It's unimaginable to conceive of Singapore other than as a port. There's no reason for Singapore to exist if it had not been that Stamford Raffles decided that, it's deep water, good place to put a port. And now, of course, airport. Number 3, we have manufacturing. And actually, many people don't understand this. The reason why Singapore manufacturing constitutes 20% of our GDP. It's very unusual. America, what is manufacturing in American GDP? They got huge, big, famous companies, but manufacturing in America is about 9-10% of GDP. We are 20% of GDP. Very unusual. Hong Kong has zero manufacturing. It's all services. Why do we have manufacturing? Actually, there are a number of reasons, but the major reason is because we are a city that happens to be a country. If we only had services, you had a very high-end, high-paying jobs at the top, financial services, etc., paying very good salaries, and then everybody else would be flipping hamburgers at the bottom. Manufacturing is a means of providing a variety of jobs in the middle. That's one major reason why we have manufacturing. Now, if I were to ask you, you know how small Singapore is. You can cycle from one end of Singapore to the other within, at most, 1.5 hours. Walking takes a bit longer. If I ask you to guess how much land those 3 functions occupy, because we are a city that also happens to be a country. We are a country that happens only to be a city. Military, gateways, ports, airports. It's not like London. You can put Heathrow, goodness knows where, out of London, or KLIA. It takes 2 hours to get into Kuala Lumpur. Now with the high-speed rail, it's faster, but it's outside Kuala Lumpur. We have to have the airport in the city. And military, manufacturing, military, gateways. How many percent of land does that occupy? It's 45%. 45% of our land is occupied by just those 3 functions. And I'm not counting the water catchment area. I'm not counting housing, which is about, I think, 13-14%. I'm not counting the roads, which is actually almost as much as housing. I mean, that's why we charge such high prices for cars. So, this is how complicated it is to run the city that also happens to be a country. If you do not have a first-class government that is able to plan, and I've been in meetings. You heard I'm in government still. One of the most fascinating meetings I've ever attended was a discussion in cabinet, and they were talking about plans on the east side of Singapore, 60 years ahead. And they spend huge amount of time talking about this. At the end of it, I told some of them, I said, none of you will be alive when these plans come to fruition. But that's what you have to do in order to keep this place going. You have it's an incredibly complex organism that has to be constantly taken care of and planned. So the agencies that do this, whether it's URA or HDB or JTC and a whole host of other organizations, it's a very intricate business. Without that kind of government of very high proficiency, Singapore could not have survived. And to go back to the first generation, actually they spend their career, the rest of their career after independence, having to prove their earlier selves wrong. Because none of them believed that Singapore could exist as an independent country. Not even Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. None of them. So remember, on Singapore's founding, he cried. He described it as a moment of anguish Every time I look back on this moment, it'll be a moment of anguish. I mean, they surprised themselves, I assume. They certainly had to spend the rest of their lives proving themselves wrong. So I just would... Singapore has been called all sorts of things. Unlikely country, unlikely city-state, all of which is correct. In retrospect, it appears inevitable. It appears as though, it was inevitable that we would succeed, and that, all the things that have happened must and should have happened. But actually, nobody expected this. We are the only city-state in existence, forgetting Morocco and Vatican, and I personally believe the jury is still out as to whether or not city-states can exist for a very long time. I hope Singapore will be around. I'm fairly confident that we will be around, but actually, if we survive hundreds of years, we'll be the first city-state to do so. So on that note, I shall end, and then we'll take questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that really insightful and fascinating address. It's not often that we have the opportunity to hear from someone who has not only had such a successful corporate career, in your case in journalism, but also who has played such a significant role in shaping a government department. We now move on to the second part of the evening, which will include a few questions from myself and my peers, and then we will move the questions onto the floor. Before we begin with the serious questions, I'd like to ask, what were you like in school? Did you always know exactly what you wanted to do?
No, I was not a good student. I was from ACS, Anglo-Chinese School. I don't know whether you all have read a recent incident when some ACS boys were caught in a KTV lounge. And then the police investigated them or questioned them, and they said, "We are not gangsters, we are from ACS." I should tell you, I am from ACS, and I was a gangster. So I think I was the only person in ACS to have been elected a prefect, and the principal said, "You cannot be prefect." So that's because I'd organized, the principal had caned somebody, so I organized a protest. So I was not allowed to be a prefect. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
That's not to encourage you, but anyway.
Okay, now I understand that in your time at the Ministry of Communications and Information, you must have had some instances where you faced tensions between transparency and national security. As global politics students ourselves, we study sustainable development within a state, and as a part of this, we spoke about Singapore having been ranked as the 5th least corrupt country in 2023 by the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Could you share some insight into how you perceive a balance between transparency and accountability in governance and maintaining national stability in a Singaporean context?
I know very often people say that we are not transparent enough and so on. There's a book by Dr. Goh Keng Swee. I don't know how many of you know him, but he was as important a figure in Singapore's history as Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. We regarded him as the architect of Singapore's economy. Later, he also established the Singapore Armed Forces, and later he was Minister for Education. And his influence is quite widespread right across the board. There was a collection of his essays can't remember when it came out, maybe in the 1980s, where he observed that actually, when you read the speeches of Singapore government ministers, you'll be surprised how much we actually go and tell our people. And I think this remains true. We tell our people quite a lot, describing the intricacies of policies and why we need to do certain things. Of course, when usually it usually involves relations with our neighbors. Sometimes in interreligious or interracial relations, we are careful about what we can tell our people. But actually, the government takes great pains, even if we can't make public statements on the sensitive issues, to explain as much as possible to various groups in Singapore off the record in closed-door sessions. Actually, a large part of government comms consists of that kind of engagement. Face-to-face engagement with ministers or public officials, speaking to a varieties of people, groups of people, whether they're grassroots or religious leaders or cultural leaders, cultural communities, or clan associations, and so on. So there are inevitable sensitivities in Singapore's relationship. Our relations with our neighbors is sensitive. Sometimes racial or interreligious relations are sensitive, so we exercise a great deal of caution. But as far as possible, we try to explain the facts of life, the realities, to as many people as we can. I should say from the outset, I'm sure this question is going to come back. One thing many foreign observers find it difficult to understand. The instinct in Singapore, certainly in the political leadership, certainly in government, on any controversial issue, not to accentuate the differences that exist, but to somehow arrive at a solution that as many people as possible can accept, is a very deep instinct. Perhaps it was born from our experience in the 1960s when there were racial riots in Singapore. But this instinct is very real and is very deep. I can give you so many instances. We had a problem about Malay women wanting to wear tudung in the so-called uniformed services. It took us a long time to resolve this issue, but we finally arrived at a settlement where they allowed nurses to wear tudung, but we didn't allow that in the uniformed military service as well as the police. It took a long time to have various groups in Singapore, including the Malay Muslims, as well as the Chinese and the Indians, non-Muslims, to accept this. All of you would have heard of how we dealt with Section 377A, the notorious Section 377A, which criminalized sex between men. Women could have sex quite freely, but anyway, but somehow or the other, thanks to the British, we inherited this law. It was the British Victorian law, which was first introduced in India, and then since our penal code comes from India, we imported it from India. And we had this law. We finally arrived at a solution where we decriminalized Section 377A, or we just took it off the books. But then we said that marriage shall continue to be that between a man and a woman. It wasn't a solution that satisfied everybody. I mean, the religious groups, both Christians as well as Muslims, were against decriminalizing, but they felt reassured by the fact that we were still insisting that marriage should be banned between a man and a woman. The liberal groups, including LGBT groups, were unhappy that we had constitutionally said marriage has to be between a man and a woman, but they were happy about Section 377A. But that was the only solution that the Prime Minister and the Cabinet felt was reasonable or could be maintained. Now we are having a problem with Israel-Hamas. Many Muslim Singaporeans are very angry about what's happening. They wish the government to take a stronger line, but the government, for a variety of reasons, has to take the balanced position it does. And so we take a lot of pain to arrive at a solution, arrive at a position that keeps as many people as possible together. It's a very deep instinct in the Singapore government. Whenever an issue arises, we try not to take a position that would underline the differences and accentuate the disagreements. It's a very deep instinct. Even on C77A, your personal view may be in one direction, but you have to accept, at least I do, that this is the reason why they act the way they do. Yeah. It's a long answer to your question.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Can I have some water? Yeah, go ahead.
So during your speech earlier, you had unraveled the complexity of Singapore being a city and a country, touching on both geographical, institutional, and moral aspects that make it so unique, make the state so unique and almost like a miraculous anomaly. What are some potential future issues you think may arise from being an outlier, and if not, why not?
I need to say something. We pat ourselves on the back and say that we did such a lot of nice things and good things, the right things and so on. But I should say this, we also were very lucky. We became independent in 1965, and then we decided we're going to be a global city. We're going to plug into the global economy. And it so happened, we didn't know it then, but actually looking back, it was a relatively benign period in global history, notwithstanding the wars in the Middle East, Vietnam, etc., etc. But barriers to trade fell gradually. From GATT, we got WTO. Barriers to the movement of investments and talent also fell gradually. Singapore exists, the only reason why Singapore exists is inconceivable to think of Singapore other than as an open economy. And we came into independence at just the right time in history when barriers of all kinds were coming down. And so we benefited from that. Now you see a reversal, right? The US has passed the CHIP Act. The only thing the Democrats and the Republicans agree upon is that they all hate the Chinese. So they passed the CHIP Act. There is onshoring of supply chain, processes and so on, because they don't want to be caught in a situation where they are subject to all kinds of barriers. So the Americans in particular, and also the Europeans, are giving incentives to their companies to bring back all sorts of manufacturing processes, and the supply chain is being concentrated as much as possible. I don't think you will have a situation like in the after the First World War when the world closes in upon itself. I don't think it will become as bad as that, simply because technology has become such that I don't think they'll be able to reverse the process of a globalization totally. But actually, that is the biggest threat to Singapore. That is what I worry about. I know we like to pat ourselves on the back, but actually, we lucked into the situation. And if that reverses, then we are in trouble. And of course, the elephant, 800-pound in the room is the US-China conflict. And if we were forced to choose, it'd be very difficult.
Yeah, thank you so much
Yeah.
for your response.
Yeah. So, which is why I said we have survived this long, but it's not a sure thing that we will survive for another 500 years.
So you've held dual positions in government and a think tank concurrently.
This is supposed to be one of the controversial questions. Okay.
Which is particularly uncommon in Western nations, such as the United States, where people usually relinquish one role to serve in the other. Some argue there should be interdependence between these two, or independence between the two sectors.
Okay.
One that implements policies, one that researches them. Did you ever feel conflicted between these two roles, and was there ever some tension? And if so, how did you manage that? Can you give an example of when you thought you managed this well, or once where you thought you didn't get the balance quite right?
I can't answer the last one. You have to ask my colleagues. Let me explain. This is IPS, reference to IPS, is the Institute of Policy Studies, which is now part of Lee Kuan Yew School, which is part of NUS. But IPS began as a company limited, it was CLGs, company limited by guarantee, limited guarantee, right? It was established by the Singapore government. The idea for IPS originated with the then Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, who later became Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Goh Chok Tong. And it was established as a government think tank. So I'm not the first director of IPS to have held appointments in government. The very first director of IPS held appointment in government. In fact, almost all the directors of IPS have held dual appointments or triple appointments, or in the case of Tommy, I don't know, 10 appointments elsewhere in government. First director was Chan Heng Chee, who later became our ambassador to the United States and the UN and then United States. The second director is Tommy Koh, who was, of course, also ambassador, still is ambassador at large, and all sorts of things, chairman of NEA, what is it called? Yeah, I mean, NHB and all sorts of things. And then we had one director who was an academic who didn't have a government position. She was there for 2-3 years, and then we went back to my predecessor, Ong Keng Yong, who was press secretary to the Prime Minister and CE of People's Association. And then, so it is a government think tank. So we like to think of ourselves, we are not part of we are of the government, but not part of the government. As for whether or not there is a conflict, last year at the 35th anniversary conference of IPS, I asked the IPS team to go and interview all our chief critics and asked them what they thought about IPS, and we broadcast what they said. And of course, all the usual stuff was said, government not brave enough, etc., etc. And we broadcast it. We showed it at the conference, 35th anniversary conference. And then I didn't criticize them in my response. I didn't say they are wrong. I said, you have to listen to what people think of you. And then I described what IPS did. And I noted, among other things, the number of times IPS work has been cited by the leader of the opposition, much to my embarrassment, in Parliament. But it happens. So it has to be that way. I don't think we need to apologize that we were established as a government think tank. In other words, it is a part of LKY School. Lee Kuan Yew School does all the theoretical stuff. We are in the field of applied research. We are looking at the practical difficulties of implementation of policy. And we work with the government. We do a lot of work for the government, contracts, commissions, grants, etc. But in order to be convincing, in order for it to have any utility, it has to measure up. It has to be honest. It has to be as objective as possible. And it has to be open to being questioned and challenged, which is what we do. So that's my answer. Now, I'm not the first IPS director who was also a government servant, nor would I probably be the last.
If it's okay, I'd like to ask you another question. You had a talk about Singapore's audacious choices, and given your deep insights into Singapore's history and the complexity surrounding its separation from Malaysia, as you mentioned in your speech earlier as well, I'm curious about your perspective on contemporary public policy challenges facing Singapore, and how do you envision Singapore navigating future socioeconomic and geopolitical shifts while maintaining its distinct identity as a global state? As you
Geopolitical
mentioned?
shifts.
Yes.
And maintaining your identity in the face of those shifts. It's a very serious question. No, I mean, it's a risk. I think some of you may have heard about what's going on what they call influence ops and so on. We are subject to all sorts of pressures and influence from a variety of sources. China is obvious. China has shifted its policy with regards to overseas Chinese. Many years ago, 1954, was Bandung Conference. Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China at that time, made a very famous declaration where he distinguished between Chinese overseas who remain Chinese citizens and ethnic Chinese overseas who take up the citizenship of the country they're living in. It says, the first is Chinese, my responsibility. Second is no longer Chinese national. They owe their loyalty to the countries they belong in. The current president of China has shifted this policy. I don't know the Chinese phrase they use, but they now say all Chinese, ethnic Chinese, should be proud of the motherland, what the motherland has accomplished or is accomplishing. So that is a very powerful change. The Chinese are not the only ones doing it. The Indians are also doing it. Narendra Modi, when he goes around, visit Australia, wherever it is, US, Singapore, he holds rallies where Indian nationals Indians are invited. When he came to Singapore, he held a rally, 18,000 people turned up. Most of them were Indian nationals, Indian citizens, but there were some Singapore Indians. So all these countries are doing this. It is inevitable that our identity is contested by a whole host of people. If the Americans knew how to do this, they'll do the same. And it's always been the case. I think after, almost 60 years of independence, next year, 2025, will be the 60th anniversary of Singapore's separation, independence. The Singapore identity is stronger, but there will be contestation, and this is one of the problems we face. I'm actually, personally speaking, I'm surprised the extent to which the Singapore identity has been established. I mean, I've got young colleagues down here from IPS. Both of them are Chinese. I know I have Malay officers, I have Indian officers. I can't tell them apart. They have grown very similar. Even when the Malay officers are wearing tudung, actually, they are the same. Their instincts are the same. They speak the same bad English. Their worldview is the same. I'm surprised the extent to which we have established the Singapore identity. But that doesn't mean that, Narendra Modi comes knocking and says, I give you overseas Indian citizenship. There is overseas Indian citizenship. I mean, I can apply, I'll be given overseas Indian citizenship. I can't vote in India, but I've got every other privilege. A lot of people might take it up, Indian nationals. Indians, not Indian nationals, Indian Singapore citizens. Yeah. So this is the reality. We're very conscious of this. Yeah. But in a way, America also has faced the same situation.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. You are an Indian national about to become a Singaporean.
Hopefully.
So, in other countries, some think tanks are funded by special interest groups or even wealthy individuals and serve the purpose of advocacy rather than actually informing policy discourse. So, that's a consequence of heavy emphasis on in those nations on freedom of speech. So, with all the pros and cons that come with that, of course. How do you see the roles of think tanks in Singapore, and how, in your view, since you run a think tank here, should think tanks fit into the Singapore ecosystem?
Well, this is a continuation of the previous question. Actually, we don't have that many think tanks in Singapore. Most of the so-called research institutions are academic-based. The IPS is probably the only general-purpose think tank that we have. In other words, we do purely applied work on domestic issues. There are a whole host of other regional or based think tanks, the Middle East Institute, South Asian Institute, East Asia Institute, that look at particular regions in the world. We have some specialized domestic policy institutes, Energy Institute, Water Institute, Finance, something or the other. But we are the only general purpose think tank, as I said, established by the government. Inevitably, the voices who want to have an impact on policy will multiply in Singapore. It's inevitable. It's already happened, right? And on the whole, I think it is a good thing. And on the whole, I think it contributes to the richness of discussion. But it is not inevitable or automatic that, many voices, therefore you have more wisdom and therefore we'll have better policies. That's not my experience. Because, I hate to say this, but actually, I have to be careful here. I don't want to suggest that we don't want to hear from many voices. Some issues in policy are very complex, and it's very difficult to understand all the things involved. You take, for example, reserves. You must have noticed there's been sort of recurrent debate on the reserves and what to do about the reserves. But the number of people who understand all the issues involved in the reserves and the management of the reserves is probably minuscule, because it is actually a very complex field, it is a very complex issue. I don't mean to suggest by that, therefore, that we don't need to talk about the reserves, or we should not debate the reserves. But I've been following this debate. I happen to have worked on it as a journalist, so I know quite a bit about the reserves. And I know how difficult it is to understand this issue. So it is inevitable that many more people want to have a say in a great variety of issues, from whether it is nature or sustainability or foreign policy or reserves or whatever, right? And I think you need to create structures to facilitate those exchange, and because that is how a society grows, right? And that is how people begin to have a stake in their country. I mean, if they don't have a say, if they don't feel they have a say in the running of the country, that they will, there's no reason why they would want to remain in the country or want to be part of this country. But nevertheless, I personally am puzzled as to how we can simultaneously retain respect for knowledge, for expertise, and for authority. It is not an easy problem to solve. I mean, I follow the debates in America, and the amount of garbage that is spoken by congressmen and senators is astounding. America will survive that. It survive all sorts of presidents. Singapore can't survive. Yeah. I mean, let me tell you this. I mean, I mentioned the reserves. I don't know how much you all know about the reserves, but there are three big buckets where the reserves are contained, held. One is Monetary Authority of Singapore, which is the central bank, the equivalent of the Federal Reserve. It holds the official reserves. Then you have Temasek Holdings, which owns all the government investments, government-linked companies and so on. And then, of course, it has its investments in a whole host of things. It's a sovereign wealth fund. And then third is the Government Investment Corporation, GIC, which holds all the rest of the reserves. It invests our foreign reserves overseas. It's a fund manager. We amassed these reserves actually without intending to. From the very beginning, I mentioned his name, Goh Keng Swee, first budget, 1959. He was faced with a looming deficit of about 40 million or whatever it was, and he converted it into a surplus of 1 million by slashing everyone's salaries and cutting expenditure. And then you set aside every year the surplus from the budget, and your savings grew. Then 1981, suddenly he said that MAS has got too much money, Monetary Authority of Singapore, so the excess reserves was parked in GIC. If all that were to disappear, if we were to spend all that money, can you amass another set of reserves? The answer is no. So if you haven't watched this documentary series, CNA did a documentary series on the reserves. They interviewed the Prime Minister, they interviewed a whole host of people. They showed people the gold vault. So we have gold stored underground somewhere or the other, our Singapore equivalent of Fort Knox. It was a very interesting series, and the Prime Minister said, actually, if we were to lose this, it is not possible to recreate it. And the reason is that if you want to recreate it, you will have to cut expenditure massively and save again. So he said, actually, you are in the Garden of Eden right now. You get out of the Garden of Eden, you can't get back in. I actually don't think many people understood what he was talking about. They didn't understand, because how do you understand the mechanism of the reserves? Even the Christians didn't understand what he was talking about. But that's what it is. How do you explain this? It's very difficult to explain. Do you understand why? Yeah. It's very difficult. It's a huge resource Singapore has, that we have the reserves. So 20% of our budget expenditure, 1/5, actually comes from returns from the reserves. If we didn't have the reserves, our GST, what you all pay in the sales tax, will be double. Income tax will be much higher. So you have this resource. What he was trying to say is once you lose it, in essence, actually, we don't know how we got here. We didn't plan for this. We just save, and then suddenly we discovered, oh, we have this. And then we made use of it. And then now it's very difficult to explain to Singaporeans, if you lose this, you will never get it back. How do you explain this? It's a political issue, but it's also an intellectual issue. Yeah.
Thank you so much again for your insight. I do think that's all we have time for. So now let's move the questions over to the audience if you guys have any. Just raise your hand if you have a question.
Hi, thank you for your talk and the questions earlier, sir. I'd like to follow up a bit more regarding what you said regarding reserves. And one of the big things that came up during the Budget 24 announcement was the debate between DPM Lawrence Wong and Leader of Opposition Mr. Pritam Singh regarding the hike of GST from 7 to 9%, which has occurred over the last couple of years. So my question to you is, with your knowledge and your expertise regarding Singapore's position on an international platform, how does the government manage some of the big challenges of trying to attract foreign talent to invest in Singapore, i.e. the lack of a capital gains tax, for example, versus balancing local interests, which has now seen GST push up from 7 to 9%? Because one of the big things that Leader Opposition Mr. Pritam Singh mentioned was the importance of using our reserves, but also the importance of the average Singaporean should not be having to suffer as a result of that. So what is your view on Singapore's position in terms of attracting foreign investment, but also holding its people to some level of support?
Sorry, I didn't. Attracting foreign investment to balancing
the way that local Singaporeans, average Singaporeans have to deal with a GST hike, for example, is one of the big talking points.
So a trade-off between local interests and being attractive location for investments. Yes. It's not been a problem so far because the government has been able to use an old-fashioned phrase, deliver the goods. Right? So we've given people a better standard of living generation after generation, and therefore they were able to accept the trade-offs that had to be put in place. These are the incentives we gave in order to attract investments. These are the schemes we have put in place in order to attract foreign talent and foreigners into our country, but because they could see the benefits of that, we were able to maintain this policy. There were occasions when that balance did not quite work out, like for example, 2011, the economy grew too fast after the global financial crisis. We had a huge spike in foreigners coming into Singapore, and there was a lot of pressure on transport, there was a lot of pressure on housing, rental markets went up, and the ruling party paid a price in the 2011 general election. So there is always a balance. It is a very difficult balance to maintain, but there is no choice for Singapore other than to be open. The possibility of Singapore existing as a closed economy is zero. You can't. But nevertheless, it's a real political question. It's very easy for the leader of the opposition to say, no need to reserve, no need to increase GST, just use more of the reserves. But as Deputy Prime Minister and others have explained, even the Prime Minister intervened in the debate, earlier version of the debate, to explain why you can't. If the reserves was growing, every year by, what they claim, then the net investment return contribution to the reserve should also be growing as a percentage of GDP. It isn't growing. It's actually been steady at 3.5% of GDP. If we were to draw down, yes, we can draw down more from the reserves, but it means that our future contribution will decline as a percentage of GDP. And somebody will have to make up for the difference. The difference will have to be made up in taxes, which is what they're not saying. So I think on the whole, so far, the population, largely because of my generation, not so much the younger people, they are instinctively fiscally conservative. So they saw that actually during COVID, suddenly we were able to draw down these huge amounts of money from the reserves. And then they said, okay, we did right in order to put aside this money, otherwise we wouldn't have had this. So I think so far, it's significant that the opposition did not accept Mr. Lee's, Prime Minister Lee's challenges to make this an election issue. They have not accepted it as a challenge. Yeah. But that's the reality. It is a trade-off. If we fail to deliver the goods to people, then the balance will. It's very easy to become nativist, you know. It's very easy.
Thank you, sir.
Singapore is quite unique in how it's been able to maintain its racial harmony. So how do you think the government's been able to achieve this, and do you foresee any challenges that this could cause in the future?
On race and religion? Okay. By having draconian laws. Yeah. We can arrest and detain people without trial for making bigoted and racist remarks in Singapore. Any number of US politicians who make these kinds of remarks would have been arrested in Singapore. Mr. Lee Kuan Yew somewhere or the other says that he makes no apology for, I can't remember what phrase he used, but intervening in people's personal lives. We tell people what language they can speak, where do they stay, and so on, we did that, right? I mean, the easiest thing for the Singapore government to have done, Lee Kuan Yew, we got booted out of Malaysia because we were a Chinese majority state, right? Which wasn't willing to accept Malay dominance in Malaysia. That's what happened, right? So the easiest political thing to have Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and his colleagues to have done on August 9, 1965, is say, this shall be a Chinese state, we shall have Mandarin as the national language. They didn't do that. And then later we passed laws. We passed, the first constitutional amendment we made after independence was to establish the Presidential Council of Minority Rights, which actually has veto power over the legislation. It's chaired by the Chief Justice. Any law in Singapore that infringes on the rights of racial minorities, the Presidential Council of Minority Rights can overrule that law. Right? And then later we pass legislation, you use religion for politics, I can arrest you. The Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act. This is the fact. And then we told people, okay, every housing estate, you can't have more than this percentage of Chinese, can't have this much fewer than Malays, Indians, etc. This ethnic integration program. We did all this. It's very intrusive. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative is you go to London, you'll see the alternative. You have whole sections of, there's Jamaica section, the Jamaican section, there is a Indian section, all kinds of, well, they're ghettos. We had very intrusive laws, so that it is not all love and fellowship. Yeah, I mean, they've arrested people for Chinese chauvinism.
Thank you very
They've
much.
closed down newspapers for that reason.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming tonight and for your comments. I'm kind of curious, maybe this is actually going to follow up on that. I'm wondering if I can ask you to wear a number of your hats simultaneously as a journalist, as the director
I'm
of...
no longer a journalist. I used to be a journalist.
Well, I'm going to...
Yeah, okay.
Over the course of your life, because I was going to say journalist, director of an institute, a think tank, perhaps even as an English teacher, a former English teacher. if you were writing the story of Singapore,
Yeah.
and going back to like the national identity, and you had to write the title of your book,
Yeah.
what would the title of the book be?
Actually, yeah, the country that should not have existed. Yeah. Yeah. You know, I mentioned my father recently. You know, up to the day he died, he never emotionally accepted separation. He never did. He always felt Singapore was part of Malaya. And that generation and the generation that exists now, my young colleagues, it's two separate things. They would find that sentiment incomprehensible. So, how did this happen? It was not planned for. Yeah, I mean, our founding father cried when we became independent. In despair, not out of happiness. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your speech. So you touched on the China and US relationship,
Yeah.
and how the escalation and conflict between them may present challenges for Singapore. So considering that Singapore has ties with both of the major powers, how do you think it should navigate its diplomatic position between them to preserve its unique identity amidst these challenges?
The Chinese saying, you take, one
step at a
stone
time.
after another.
Okay.
I don't think anyone has an answer to that question. It's very worrisome. Right now, things seem to have settled down for a bit. President Xi and President Biden had a recent meeting at, G20 or something. But all you need is one accident. The planes are buzzing each other in the sky. We had an accident before off Hainan Island, you remember? I can't remember when it was, 2003 or something like that. And then Yeah. And then he caused a huge ruckus at that time when things were actually okay between the two countries. Can you imagine an accident like this happening now? I mean, all of you, I don't know how many of you do history here, but just go and read up how World War I started. It was an accident.
Okay, thank you for your speech. So you said that Singapore tries not to take sides because we don't want to...
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, sorry. So you mentioned that Singapore tries not to take sides, for instance, in the Israel-Palestine crisis.
No. We don't take... No. We are not neutral.
Okay, so basically my question was more about, for instance, with Russia and Ukraine, we've taken quite a strong opposition against Russia.
Yeah.
So how does the government kind of deal with the public responses, if there are any, to these reactions? And how do they decide which cases they want to take a more public stance against?
On Ukraine, Russia, I think we had the overwhelming majority support for the position we took. It's very simple. Big country invades small country, we object on principle simply because we are a small country. Right? There's no two ways. I mean, US invaded Grenada. I don't know how many of you remember that. Ronald Reagan did that. We objected. We voted against the US. So there's no two ways about it. On Israel-Hamas, we are not neutral. Hamas attack on October 7th, we condemn because it's terrorism, and if we do not condemn it, they were and probably are still any number of groups around us who may consider doing the same to us. But we also think it is wrong the way in which Israel has gone about in its response, because its response its response in Gaza contravenes international law on humanitarian. There are actually, believe it or not, there are laws on war, how you should conduct war. And it is wrong. We have also voted against Israeli settlements in the West Bank, in the United Nations. So it's not true that we've not taken sides. We have to take principled positions. Or as the Prime Minister said, we cannot be afraid of sticking our head out of the parapet on all these issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You mentioned how PM Lee put a challenge to the leader of the opposition to make the reserves an election issue.
Yeah.
But there's some who'd argue that the election system in Singapore isn't completely fair. With the elections department under the Prime Minister's office, the boundaries shifting a lot, and GRCs making it hard for opposition, for other parties to run against the PAP. What would be your response to that?
I mean, I wish that were true, so there'll be fewer contests, but it's not true because all seats are contested. I should say this, actually, the desire for opposition and checks and balances is now deeply ingrained in the Singapore population. The overwhelming majority of Singaporeans may want the PAP and expect the PAP, the ruling party, to form the government, but majority of Singaporeans also want a strong opposition. So actually, you must understand this about the political situation in Singapore. It is an anomaly. It exists in no other country. In effect, there are two poles going on at any one time. Number one, what do you think about the performance of the government? And number two, whether or not we want more opposition. And the two poles are not related. It's not like in America, the Democrats go up, the Republicans go down. Or Britain, Labour goes up, Conservatives go down. In Singapore, the government can say, yes, Singapore government performing very well. Do I need more opposition? Yes. The two are not related. This is an anomaly, right? Once in a while, you have, Mr. Tharman Shanmugaratnam coming around, and then they say, yes, I'll vote for him, and in his case, I don't need an opposition. So he gets 70%. So it is an anomalous situation. Now, going back to whether or not what the government does about boundaries and so on, you go around Singapore, actually every part of Singapore resembles every other part. It's not like in America, that is urban, that is rural, that is the East Coast or the coast and the, flyover country. There are different parts. There are different regions. This is a city. And cities, even in America, you go and take a look at cities. Cities are natural one-party governments. It's inevitable because the distinctions within a city are not that dramatic. So if you have a change in government in Singapore, it's likely to be flipped like that. You have a dominant PAP and then it flips and it becomes a dominant some other party. It's going to be like that. It will be like that. Otherwise, it will be, this what you have now. I want the PAP in power, but, I would like some opposition. And it's a very deep-seated advice and deep-seated desire. And actually, how can you say it's wrong? Because checks and balances are good. Everyone thinks so. It's good to, to have your ministers answer questions in Parliament and be forced to answer questions and for people to feel that they are holding the government accountable. It's inevitable. I think it is inevitable that Singapore politics will become more plural. Whatever that means, It may mean more opposition, it may mean all sorts of things. Yeah.
Okay. Mr. Devan, I have questions. As we all know, it's often reported that Singapore is an aging society.
It is.
And it's going to be, one out of four.
I'm an example of that, yeah.
So 1 out of 4, Singapore resident citizens going to be 65 and above by 2030 and so on.
No, it's worse than that.
Oh, it could be worse than that, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm sure as part of the work in IPS, you guys would think about, how the country would be 30 years, 50 years from now. And if we are aging, obviously many, in 50 years of now, Singapore obviously cannot have a shrinking populations. So we'll have to continue to attract foreign talents and so on, and rebalance the racial mix and so on. Question would be, how does Singapore government thinks, or IPS works involved in planning such scenario 50 years from now, where the citizens will be a smaller percentage of the overall populations unless you start converting. And you also need to make sure that the country's populations do grow at a decent pace as well to support. There have been 8 million populations planning parameters being thrown about as well. So kind of thinking out 50 years from now, if the population reach 8 million, but the makeup of the country populations, be it from the various multi-ethnic backgrounds and so on, will shift. So, what do you think from an IPS viewpoint, what will be the significant change long-term wise in the social fabric and the cultural DNA in Singapore?
It's a very serious problem, and I don't know whether we have the answers. IPS has done a lot of work on this, population projections and so on, over the years. The TFR, the measure of, what does TFR stand for? Huh? Total fertility rate, has gone down below 1. So it's a very bad situation. We have been able to grow our citizen core at a steady rate by bringing in new citizens to the tune of about 20,000 to 25,000 a year. So we've been doing that steadily. And then, of course, the permanent resident portion has remained more or less stable at 600,000. Then we bring in foreign laborers, employment bars or whatever it is. Now, because we have had to ramp up our construction, the proportion of the number of work pass holders has gone up. When you do that, there is a blowback, as somebody here alluded to just now. Many Singaporeans suddenly will feel this country doesn't belong to them. I don't think we are as badly off as many other countries. I don't think yet, but the risk is always there. It's very easy to stir up xenophobic sentiments. And, you see that being done here in Singapore too. There is no easy solution to this. It has to be constantly managed. I think, you become a new citizen and then they call them new citizens, but the second generation will become like the rest of Singaporeans. But it is a serious issue that has to be constantly managed. Yeah. But as I said, there is no alternative to Singapore being open. It's not conceivable to think of Singapore as a viable city-state, let alone a country, that is not open. And you can't, people say, okay, we don't need to grow our population, we can survive, more productive, etc. Actually, it's not so easy. And if you reduce the number of immigrants, or you reduce the growth rate of the foreign workforce population, your growth is going to suffer. And when your growth suffers, you will have all kinds of other problems. So we are we hope to have 0.5 to 1% workforce growth rate, and then hopefully you'll have 2% productivity growth rate, which is actually really, really quite optimistic, So you'll have about maybe 2-3% GDP growth a year. But it's very difficult to maintain the balance. We didn't succeed last year. Hopefully this year we might. Yeah. But you already see the problems as a result of slowing growth last year. The median growth, wage growth sort of declined. And then everyone makes noise. Yeah. It's not easy.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. So I have a pretty basic question. So to what extent do you believe that Singapore is the best example of a country who has many religions, but still be one of the safest country in the world?
I couldn't hear. I couldn't hear. Again.
Okay, I can repeat that. So to what extent do you believe that Singapore is the best example of a country who has many people with different religions, but still be one of the safest country in the world?
I don't think we are the most. So far, it has worked, and it wasn't because Singaporeans are better human beings than other people. We happen to have a strong government. We were lucky in many ways. As I said, became independent at a particularly benign period in global history, so our economy was able to grow rapidly, in part because we took the right decisions. And politically, we settled the major quarrels very early in our existence. So there was the fight between the non-communist left and the communist left, was more or less settled in '63. Then we went through this period in 1965. Through 1965 in Malaysia, there was the other big question on race. We decided how we should govern ourselves on questions of race. And then '65, the PAP for a long time was the only party in government. And then 1981, one lone opposition won a seat. And then after that, for many years, it was just two. So we had a very prolonged period of political stability. And we were able to take a lot of tough decisions and then allow the tough decisions to show results. And then there was a self-reinforcing dynamic. So we were able to contain many of these, what in other countries turned out to be very fractious issues on race, on language, and religion. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. We had to deal. When I went to school, more than half, almost half of my school cohort went to non-English schools. There was my platoon mates in the military were from Chinese schools. And there were some went to Malay schools, some went to Tamil schools. And then slowly the whole system changed. It became English-based, and everyone did second language their mother tongue. But that took a long process. We were lucky. Can other countries follow the same path? Their histories are more complex, and their political situations are more fraught. But I can say personally, looking at some of the countries that were an inspiration to us, it's very sad to see what's going on. I began this morning quoting Jawaharlal Nehru, and then you see what's happening. It's in India now, it's very different. It can easily unravel. We put in place all these laws. We were lucky. And I think with each passing generation, Singaporeans of various races feel more Singaporean than they do Chinese, Malay, or Indian. But as I said, it can reverse very easily.
Okay, thank you. With increasing global challenges such as climate change and geopolitical shift, how do you envision Singapore's role evolving in the world stage? And what step can us, like the younger generation, take to contribute to Singapore's continued success as a nation state?
Wow. Talking about climate change, that's a very serious challenge. The Prime Minister spoke about it in the National Day Rally 2019, and spoke about it as a existential crisis. And he said, I think the statement he made is, everything else has to bend at the knee to what does he say? Everything else has to bend at the knee to climate change. In other words, how do you deal with this? Quite simply, if we don't deal with it, we will be drowned. as simple as that. Singapore's average is just about 100 odd, 100 meters, something like that, above sea level. It's not very high. And so whole parts of eastern Singapore would be covered. So fortunately, we have the reserves, and so we can deal with it over the long term. We are on climate change. There are limited options. We don't have many sources of alternative energy. Even if you put solar panels on every roof in Singapore, it won't be sufficient. There is hardly any wind power to speak of. So we are hoping hydrogen might turn out to be a good bet. You saw in the budget speech, the finance minister, deputy prime minister even spoke about nuclear energy. So these are big choices we'll have to make. Yeah, but yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and we'd love it to be from a student, and it needs to be short. So do we have any volunteers? I see some students over here. Excuse me. Is it short?
Thank you, Mr. Devan. As many of us here are foreign nationals, and we try to pride ourselves as a global hub, and here at the UWC, what do you think the world can learn from Singapore as a government, and what can we take to all corners of our world in the future as young people?
Well, obviously there are some things you can learn from Singapore, but I'm very conscious of the fact that our experience is sui generis. It's very difficult to apply the same lessons overseas. Like, for example, we have accumulated these reserves. 20% of our budget revenue comes from the reserves. Is it possible for every other country to replicate the same structure? Actually, the answer is probably not. It's very difficult to replicate what took 40, 50 years within a few years. As I said, Dr. Goh Keng Swee, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, when they started in 1959, didn't think that this is where they would end. They didn't know. It just happened that way. But a lot of, I would make this point, actually Singapore's, where we are, is not perfect. There's a lot of things wrong here, a lot of things that needs to be fixed, a lot of things that can improve. But Singapore, from the point of view of governance, is evidence that actually what matters most in politics is values. That generation, not only the leadership, by the way, that entire generation were imbued with certain values, which I suppose they might be described as conservative or traditional, but those values were very important, including, frugality, prudence, etc., but also, as important, tolerance, acceptance of people of other races, other religions. Those are very important things. Singapore has always been a diverse society with many religions, many races, many languages. Even among the Chinese, there were numerous dialects, mutually incomprehensible. But we solve the problem by multiplicity, not by suppressing differences. We didn't say, in order to be Singaporean, you have to cease to be Chinese, Malay, or Indian. We didn't say that. We said, okay, you continue to be Chinese, Malay, or Indian, but here, we create as much common space as possible between the races. So we resolve the problem of many not by suppressing differences. From many, the e pluribus unum, from many one. The American, where does it appear? On the dollar bill, is it? E pluribus unum, from many one. We from many one in Singapore, but we did not suppress many. If we had tried to suppress the many, I would not have worked. So I think the answer to that question, I don't think there are particular programs, particular structures that you can point to and say, okay, if you take this up, you can do as well as Singapore. But I do think that the first generation and other succeeding generations got a number of things right on values. And at the top of the list, I would say, is acceptance of difference and tolerance. Yeah.
That question on values, what a great way, especially for a school, to end such a fascinating session. Thank you. It's been a fascinating evening. From separation to immigration, I made a note, electoral processes to racial issues, Israel-Hamas to reserves, climate change to demographics. So I won't attempt to summarize. In each case, though, we've heard the incredible voice of someone who's really sat at cabinet level and globally, and heard the shaping and the thinking that's gone on in the places that will affect all our lives. So it's been a wonderful evening, and we're extremely grateful. One constant I think that I heard was a soundbite, which I don't know if you've used before, but I thought it was very typical of the sort of the thinking behind each answer, which was, whatever may have seemed now totally inevitable in retrospect may have seemed utterly improbable at the time. And I think that's a theme that actually probably resonates with many of your answers, because you didn't have an easy, it's like this, but it's a sort of a sense of possibility and the sense perhaps of ways of thinking about difficult issues that is exactly the reason we hold these issues. So it only remains for me to close and to thank you incredibly, Janadas, for the generosity of your time, the warmth of you, and the insights in your answers, and to say, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Janadas Devan. And have a great evening. Thank you very much, everyone.